Good morning, everyone. How you doing? It's a pleasure to be with all of you here this morning. And I have the perhaps enviable task of trying to offer you some hope this morning about American politics. I had this conversation with several folks as I was getting ready to come here. I said, I have to go give this talk about, what to be hopeful for in American politics. I've had the privilege to be involved in American politics since I was about 13 years old. I was sitting on my couch on election night of 2004, watching the returns come in. At the time, it was the race between John Kerry and George W. Bush. And I sat there being frustrated that more young people hadn't turned out to vote. I said, if only more people of my generation had turned out, maybe we would have had a different outcome. And so I decided that I was going to do something to change that in the next election. And as a kid who couldn't vote, wouldn't be able to vote for another election cycle, I said, what could I possibly do? And so I went out and I decided to make a movie. In all of my great wisdom, I realized I had no idea how to make a movie. And so I went out and I got myself a camera and I started calling senators and members of Congress and I said, will you be in my movie? And this amazing thing happened, which is that people started to say yes. I ended up, over the course of about 2 years, interviewing 100 senators and congressmen for this film. We took it out in the 2008 election cycle and ended up registering over 25,000 new young voters all across the United States. I had this amazing experience because as I traveled around the country, I got to meet people who had been just like myself, frustrated, cynical, wishing that more people would participate. And they said, thank you for doing this, because I didn't know that there were other people out there like me who shared this same feeling. And as I traveled around the country, I had this really interesting realization, which was that there is a huge groundswell of people who want to participate, but there are a whole host of reasons that hold people back, and particularly within this generation, a generation that I'm part of, the Millenial Generation. And as we look at this particular generation and where it has been over the past decade and where it's going, it is one of the things that offers me the most hope. Because when you look at the trends that we face in American politics today, there are these deep-seated feelings of anger, of frustration. You have a symptom of really what is become a global problem of frustration that there are people at the top of the equation, people who sit in positions of power, who have for years told people who don't sit in those same positions of power, we know what we're doing. We know how these things are supposed to work. We know how economic systems are supposed to work. We understand how the world goes, and we are making the best decisions imaginable on behalf of you. And finally, people have said, maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's not the case that I am being well served by signing over my interests to people who don't necessarily represent me. And I'd like to have a greater voice. And so you see a rise of anger and frustration that is coming out in very troubling ways, in a lot of ways around the world. But the people who stand up to this across the board, and particularly in the United States, tend to be young people. I see this hope in people across the country who have stood up and said, not only do I not believe in this kind of politics, a politics of destruction, a politics of anger, a politics of hopelessness, but I'm actually going to do something about it. I see it in the story of a young woman in California who, in this election cycle, became the youngest woman in American history to run for United States Congress, who filed days before the deadline because she saw that there was no one opposing someone who had been in office for several terms and had not really listened to his constituents. And she said, people might call me crazy, but I'm going to stand up and do this. And she ended up getting her story told all over the world and traveled across the district right outside of San Francisco, where she was from, to fight for something that she believed in. I see it in the story of a young woman I met in Detroit named Tiffany, who grew up in one of the worst parts of town, who could have gone anywhere in the world, who was extremely talented, extremely promising, and instead decided to stay home and start an education nonprofit to try and make her community better, who rose through the ranks and now has reformed huge pieces of the education system there, and who now says, I need to actually stand up and run for public office. I need to serve my country. I need to serve my community. There's more that I can do for myself. So as I look across the country, I see these people, these individuals who are shining beacons of hope. And at Run for America, the organization that I run, we do this every day. We go out and we try and encourage people to see the opportunity that they have to change the world, to change the trajectory of our country, to change the trajectory of our political system. And we believe that everything starts with people. Everything starts with the ability of one individual inside a system to change that system over time. We believe that whether it is a tiny school, whether it is a large corporation, or whether it is the United States government, nothing works without people who have a deep-rooted sense of integrity, a deep-rooted sense of courage, who are willing to take risks, who are willing to stand up for what they believe in. And we believe that that is what's most missing today from our political system. And we say that there isn't a way that you can just have people rise to the top. People don't just suddenly wake up one day and decide en masse that I want to go into this system. In the United States alone in 2014, 79 members of the United States Congress ran unopposed. Now, if you can think about that for a second, out of a group of 435 people in a political state like this, only 79 people no one could find a reason to oppose them. And that is a result of an institution of people who have not actually thought about the need to create real meaningful representation of citizens across the country. And so that is at Run for America, what we deeply believe in is that you have to build a talent pipeline. You have to build a system that actually can help people stand up to the institutional forces that are deeply seated against the interests of average people. So when we look at where the next 10 years are headed, this is really the critical question. Will we find people who are willing to step up to the plate? Will we continue to find people who want to step up and lead? Or will we end up, as we have, with two people running for president who over 95% of the American people believe represent, either one or both of them, represent an existential threat to the future of the country? Now, when I look as a person trying to make my own decision about how I'm going to cast a ballot, if I didn't know everything I knew about politics, if I just sat there, I would say, is this really the best that we can do? Is this really the best that we have to offer? And I would look at the fact that only about 15% of people in the United States actually voted to put these two people into these positions, where one of them could be one of the most powerful leaders in the world. And I say, why is it that so few people are willing to show up? Why is it that so few people are willing to actually make one of the most critical decisions that we have the right to make? And I think a lot of that is because people don't have a sense of their own belief that they can actually change anything. That people look at the system, they look at it, and they are full of despair. They're full of hopelessness about what's actually possible. And when we come down to it, it's really up to this generation, the generation that I'm part of, to actually change that. This is a series of problems that we face that are deeply structural and that have been built up for generations by delaying the inevitable series of hard choices that we've had to make about our world, about whether it's globalization, whether it's education systems, whether it's the way that we distribute wealth across this world. We have had an absence of leadership. And so I understand people's frustration. I really do. And I think that there is a dangerous trend of dismissing the anger that we see, of saying, that's just a bunch of crazy people sitting over here who don't understand what's going on. And when we look at the way that the next decade is going to be shaped, these frustrations, these fears are at the core of it. People don't have hope for a reason. People don't believe that their governments can really lead them. We've seen a record number of governments over the past decade around the world not actually be able to get a real mandate from their citizens and from their people to say, lead me, right? And what does that say about people's appetite to work through the existing systems, to work through existing structures, to actually get something done? Do people want to outsource this responsibility to other kinds of organizations, to companies, to a sort of new techno-optimistic view of the world? I don't think that people actually do. But I think when people look and they see two people like we just had up here, although the actors were great, when they see two people, two candidates who seem to so fundamentally challenge the assumptions and beliefs of what people expect in a leader, people start to look for other solutions. And we can't let that happen. We can't abdicate that set of responsibilities. Government exists for a reason, but a government is only as good or as strong as its citizens and its people are willing to make it, as people are willing to step up and actually participate. And across the United States, we suffer mainly from a lack of participation. We suffer from the fact that we have in most primary elections, we have 10 or 15% of people who actually show up. So we have a representative body that doesn't represent the country. We have a president in the election that is fast upon us. Probably only about 50 or 60% of people will actually show up to vote in one of the most important decisions that people have to make. And when we look at that, as opposed to casting blame on citizens or people, we should look at our leadership. We're working right now on an election that we're very excited about for mayor of New York City. And in the election in 2013 to be mayor of New York City is a city of 8.6 million people. There were about 500,000 people who showed up to vote to decide who would be the mayor of New York City. And when you looked at the series of candidates who were running, some of you probably heard, or more than some of you probably heard the story of Anthony Weiner, who is a totally disgraced politician who doesn't seem to put it charitably, doesn't seem to be able to figure out how to use the private function on social media. Was running for mayor of New York City, a candidate who openly said, I don't know if I'm up for the job. I don't know if I can do this, was a candidate for mayor of New York City. So no, why should more than 500,000 people show up to vote for a group of people that so obviously can't actually serve them or leave them? So we have a problem if we can't provide people with some bare minimum level of hope or belief that their leaders can actually do the job. So that's what I think we all need to be in the business of. Each one of us has a role that we can play. The political ecosystem is made up of voters, of candidates, of people who work for candidates, for people who work for elected officials. And each one of us can offer something to the puzzle, but when each one of us looks at the system and says, this is getting worse, I don't have hope, I don't believe this doesn't work, then we only assign more and more responsibility, more and more opportunity to the worst people in the system, the people who are most in favor of keeping things stagnant, of keeping things gridlocked. And I think there's this kind of cathartic feeling about that. There's something that feels really good about saying, I'm just done with this whole system. I'm done with this. I'm so frustrated. I'm out. But that's really an abdication of responsibility. So we've got a lot of work to do to fix these things. This is not an easy challenge, but I believe it is really the defining question and the defining challenge of the 21st century. We've entered a new era of governments where being in government is no longer simply about legislation. It's not about crafting bills and setting up big comprehensive systems. It's about how we actually work to address very complicated problems that require multi-stakeholders across industries, across sectors. It's about how we actually create real solutions for problems that people have that are deeply painful and that are not easily solved, how we create solutions for systemic inequality, for systemic issues of unemployment and undereducation. And these require a different group of people at the table. We can't have the same system, the same pipeline of people who've been doing this for years, who come out of the same institutions just funneling their way into government because they may not actually be up for the job. So we have a choice. We can choose to say, we will invest in this. We will invest in making this system better. We will invest in doing this. And it is really up to this generation. The Millennial Generation is the largest generation in history. There are several billion of us globally. United States, 80 million. They will make up the overwhelming majority of the electorate by the next election. And it is a generation that is full of hope, that is trying to leave the world in some way, shape, or form better than they found it, which has been shaped by a series of searing global events over their lifetime that cause them to want to do better and do good. And it's a generation that probably, in a lot of ways, is one of the most civically minded generations that we've seen in a long time. We find ourselves in this situation often of looking to a new generation for hope, of looking to a new generation to say, will this be the group of people who are willing to step up to the plate? And I think that, in fact, at this moment in time, that question, that call, has never been more serious, has never been more consequential, to actually provide a new direction for institutions around the world and to offer a new form of leadership. And this is, to me, why we can't abandon, right, in the midst of what in the United States is probably will go down as one of the craziest elections in modern history, where you have two people who are running who 75% of the American people say both of them are people who are disqualified to run for president. It is a mind-boggling scenario, which we have a critical opportunity to actually do something about on the flip side of this, to say, we're never going to let this happen again. We're not going to let this happen, but that requires everybody standing up and doing something about it. So that's the hope that I have, is because I do think people will. I do think that as you look at the desire and the hunger that people in the United States have, I think back to what I saw when I was a kid traveling around the country, talking to people, and people said, I want this system to work. I believe deeply in the idea of democracy, in the meaning of democracy, in this important experiment for us to come together and continually improve, to continually strive, as we say, for a more perfect union. And I believe that that hope is still there. But the rope is thin. People need to see something work, some sign of faith. And I think that that requires an entire new generation of people who are willing to run for office, who are willing to step up, who are willing to say, we cast out this fear-based way of thinking and talking, this divisive way of looking at the world, of looking at everything through the lens of winners and losers, of looking at everybody as people who are either takers or being tooken. And I think that that is how we have to go forward. And in my heart of hearts, I know that there is an opportunity there. I know that this generation is willing to step up to the plate to do it. And when you look at the numbers of people in this election alone who've run for office, who are of this generation, the numbers are triple what they have been of people at this age of a generation in the past. There's a willingness to step up to the plate and do this. It doesn't happen without this kind of leadership. So with that, thank you guys very much, and happy to take some questions.